This is Karen with newclevelandradio.net, and it is time for Heart Mojo with Melinda Smith. And
Oh,
Melinda, we are talking to one of your contacts from Zonta, and
yep.
we hope that this conversation will continue. So introduce us to your guest.
One more in our series that we're doing on Zonta International. And my local club will be on soon in Cleveland. And Katherine Cleland is another Zonchan, and you're in Oregon, is that correct?
I'm actually in Seattle, Washington now.
Oh, you're in Seattle. Okay. Well, you're still different time zone.
Yep.
But we have a very interesting and serious conversation to have about early childhood marriage. And Katherine does a lot of work in that area in Zonta. So first, before we jump into that, I want to know a little bit more about you, Katherine. So tell us about you.
So I am by profession a marketer. I have run my own marketing consulting business for the past 20 years. And prior to that, I worked for some of the big names like Hewlett Packard and the Clorox Company and Procter and Gamble in marketing and communications. But I decided working with startups, especially women-owned startups, was where my heart lay. And so 20 years ago, I fledged out into my own business to work on digital marketing strategies. From there, I got the opportunity to serve as Zonta International's Public Relations and Communications Chair of the PR&C Committee from 2014 to 2016. And that really began my journey with Zonta on the international level beyond what my local club was doing. And as I worked with Zonta International on public relations and communications, I saw the need to really unite the United States clubs in advocacy. We were doing so much overseas and so much great work with our international service projects and with a lot of the advocacy we were doing at the United Nations on Sustainable Development Goal number 5, which is equality for women, gender equality, but we weren't doing it here at home in the USA. And so I worked very hard from 2016 till now to form what we call the USA Caucus, which allows the Zonta clubs in the United States to speak as one voice on key issues.
Okay. You are a busy lady doing a lot in Zonta. So talk to me a little bit about childhood marriage now, where,
so Zonta's been involved in ending child marriage for over 16 years with UNICEF and UNICEF USA as our key partners. And we've been working in countries like Madagascar and several countries in Africa to end child marriage there with programs that we were sponsoring through our international service projects. And we in the United States Caucus, as we formed, looked into the mirror and realized that the United States has one of the laxest international laws in developed countries for child marriage. At that point in time, all 50 states allowed child marriage in one form or another. And we decided that we needed to take action in the US. But it's complicated in the United States compared to most nations because marriage laws are controlled by the state, not by the federal government. And the federal government has no role that it can play other than on immigration issues to end child marriage. And so we decided to join forces with UNICEF USA and Unchained at Last to work to end child marriage state by state in the United States. Since then, child marriage has been completely banned in 10 states, with Michigan being the latest state in 2023. There's still 2 signatures the governor needs to finish that up, but it's a huge progress to go from 50 states to only 40 states allowing child marriage. But with 40 states still to go, we've still got a lot of work ahead of us.
You know, you just can't believe in this day and age that we would still have early childhood marriage in the United States. I guess I understand in some other countries. What kind of social cultural issues you have? Let's start out of the country and then move to the United States that you're up against when you're trying to stop that.
What they're seeing with child marriage worldwide is that it is often due to displacement or poverty. that girls are contracted into younger marriages to both get some kind of remuneration or support for the family who is marrying the daughter off, but also it gets the expense out of that household into another household. And so, and it tends to accelerate in times of crisis. We're seeing an uptick worldwide and in the United States on child marriages during the COVID pandemic, because of the desperation and necessity for a number of families and girls who are less protected, would be how I would put it. It allows for predatory practices to occur as well, and some forced marriages. There's also tradition and religious background in many cultures that encourage child marriage to prevent what is perceived as promiscuity or any kind of maturation of a young girl, is when that girl then is expected to be married off. But that doesn't jive with what is in the best interests of the child. And that's what we're focusing on in Zonta, is the interests of the child. And that's where our partners, UNICEF USA and Unchained at Last, also come from, is that we must focus on the child first. And even a 17-year-old girl is still a child in the United States.
How early do you find that girls are getting married off? How young are they?
So there was a great study done by the ICRW, the International Center on Research for Women in the United States. And they did a comprehensive look at child marriages in 2020. So it's a fairly recent study. And they looked at the consequences of the child marriages. And they found children being married as young as 13 in the past 10 years. And the states with the lowest ages were called out in that study, and most of them have changed their laws. And so most states do not allow child marriage as young as 13 anymore. North Carolina was particularly focused on in that study because they were a destination state where girls essentially were being trafficked to engage in child marriage, because in the United States, laws of one state are respected by the other state. So even if it's illegal in, let's say, Tennessee to get married under the age of 16, a perpetrator or a predator or a parent could take their child across state lines to North Carolina to get married at any age. But interestingly, we're fighting right now in California to enact laws, and California is one of the states with no minimum age. As long as you have parental or judicial approval, a child could be married at any age in the state of California. And there are cultural practices that would violate the rights of any girl if that is continued to be allowed.
Hard to believe. I mean, California usually is considered a progressive state.
Exactly. It's very hard to believe. Alaska has this bizarre exception for girls who are marrying into the military. So the minimum age is lower for girls who are going to marry someone who is serving in the U.S. Services. And it is an exception that dates back to, I think, World War I. But it was a different culture and different times at that point. And child marriage should not be a Band-Aid for essentially benefits that girls otherwise wouldn't be getting in society in terms of healthcare or other benefits. And that's often the reason cited for some of these younger marriages.
I hadn't even thought about that, the benefits piece of it. That wasn't something that was in my head, that they would marry for benefits. What about in other countries? Are they younger than 13?
Often they're younger than 13. The exceptions that are being reported around, particularly in Southeast Asia and Africa, are girls being betrothed as young as age 8 and married any time from 11 and above. And there is great work being done by UNICEF worldwide, as well as the organization Girls Not Brides, in many, many countries. And Zonta has funded some significant programs. That currently, we were in West Africa, and we're currently in, oh my gosh, I'm gonna mess up the name. I'll look it up and come back. to the country where our current program is. I've been less involved with the international work, much more involved at the United States level.
So, and I believe, isn't there early childhood marriage in India? It's pretty common there as well.
India, Bangladesh, Pakistan are all cited quite regularly. India has recently passed some very strong laws, and it's a question of enforcement. And it's enforcement at the provincial level in India as well as at the village level to make sure. But and it's also a lot of the work that's being done by UNICEF and Girls Not Brides is educating girls in school about their rights so they can assert those rights. But the family pressures are very, very large. And the age gap is one of the other things that we looked at very closely. And that is the age of the groom versus the age of the bride. Often, if it is more than 4 years, it's a clear indication that the marriage is not in the best interests of the girl. It's not a Romeo and Juliet scenario. And we're finding not only overseas, but in the United States, most of the marriages are of younger girls to grooms who are more than 4 years older than they are. In 36 of the 50 US states, it is actually a get out of jail free card for statutory rape. So if an older man, let's say a camp counselor, a pastor, a family friend, whoever has access to a young girl, rapes a young girl and either gets her pregnant or is found to have raped her, one of the get out of jail free cards is if he marries her, it is no longer considered statutory rape. So there's actually a reverse incentive.
So even though it happened before the marriage.
Yeah, that was my question.
Yes, even though it happened before the marriage, it's a get out of jail free card. But what it does is it entraps the girl. Because the concern that the parents have is, especially if the girl gets pregnant, is there going to be an out of wedlock child? What is the shame or the religious issues or the other issues brought upon the family? What they don't look at is the consequences for the girl. And often, and the statistics from ICRW are really clear on this, that it's a devastating consequence for girls who get married before the age of 18. They have a significantly less chance of completing any kind of education. The dropout rate is extremely high. They are, of course, more likely to get pregnant and bear multiple children very early, which has long-term health consequences. A girl's pelvis is not mature at 14, 15, 16, or 17. And there are complications with those young pregnancies, plus long-term complications for the overall girl's health. But equally importantly is what ICRW found is that these girls are 80% of them report experiencing some form of domestic abuse, whether it's domestic violence, whether it's financial abuse, whether it's emotional abuse or controlling behaviors. They are traumatized basically in that early marriage with a perception not only of the actual abuse that's happening, but there's no way to get out. Domestic violence shelters in most states will not accept brides under the age of 18. So if you're 17, you're in a marriage, you're being physically abused, you cannot go to a DV shelter because they are by statute for 18 and above. They cannot take children in under the law. In addition, in most states, a 17-year-old cannot enter into a contract that's legally binding. Therefore, they cannot hire a lawyer. They cannot retain counsel to get a divorce.
Wow.
They have no way out until they're 18 or older. And often the controlling behavior and the emotional abuse, plus family coercion is also often involved, prevent girls from making their own decisions even upon turning 18 and becoming adults. And so it traps these girls in a situation where they have no control over their own lives. And it's not an abuse, it's a human rights abuse that we should not be perpetrating in the United States.
It seems like that's most likely to happen with a groom that's much older, more controlling than somebody who's closer to their age. Would that be the case, you think?
They didn't give any statistics on the specifics by age. One of the biggest challenges is getting the data. And so states only report marriage statistics county by county. And in some states like Texas, there are literally hundreds of counties. And often they'll record an underage marriage, but they won't record the age of the bride and the groom, so we don't know the age difference. In California, they do not keep statistics at all. So it's very, very difficult to try and collect and understand the size of the problem. And a bill was forwarded 3 years ago in California just to collect the statistics. And because of the expense of that at the county clerk level, and it would be an unfunded mandate because they didn't have funding at the government level to support giving that information, giving the funds to the county clerks to collect that information and share it, it didn't pass because it had financial consequences. And so getting this data is one of the things that Unchained at Last has worked really hard on. They did a comprehensive study in 2018 across all 50 states using some statistical projections, like for California, where they did not have specific data. They used neighboring states and demographic information. But they went through and had someone collect county by county across every county in the United States where statistics were available. And that they found that there were 300,000 child marriages in the 8 years from 2010 to 2018 that they surveyed. 300,000 in the United States. And they have on their website, Unchained at Last, a map where you can look state by state to see how many marriages were in your specific state in that time frame. And they are now updating that study with the knowledge from talking to states and county clerks that there's been an uptick during COVID. And the incidence of child marriage actually increased, as well as the incidence of domestic violence in the general population. We're seeing huge spikes in need for DV services, both during COVID and since the pandemic has subsided a little bit.
Do they have any thoughts on why that happened? I can see the domestic violence. People were pushed together, right, and stuck in the house together. But why childhood marriage? Why child marriage?
My guess, and this is just speculation, many of the childhood marriages are either religious marriages or they are due to an unplanned pregnancy in many different cultures. You'll see them in everything from the Christian right to strict Muslim cultures to Mormon culture to pretty much, yeah, across the spectrum. Especially in immigrant populations, if a young girl has engaged in sexual activity and that is known, or she has gotten pregnant, then she is to be married immediately. And during the pandemic, you can imagine that with people being at home and not a lot of other things to do.
Right. That's why, yeah, I have a little population uptick too.
Too, exactly. And that probably happened with the underage girls as well.
Is there more
to these younger age girls getting married? Okay. Have they been living out in the public, meaning are they going to school? Are they doing family things so that they may have heard that this is not the way they want to live their life?
The survivors that I've spoken to, and Unchained at Last also has a huge survivor network because they provide direct support to survivors of child marriage and forced marriage. And the survivors that I've spoke to really feel like they were often brought up in communities where girls did not have any decision-making capability over their own lives and were I don't want to use the word groom, but we're brought up to believe that this is the natural course and this is what is expected of them. And they were also sold a bill of goods that the fantasy of what a marriage would be like and the reality of what being married to generally an older man and having children young was like were two completely different things.
Okay.
And then there was no way out. And the agency that a girl has at 16 or 17, if she's been brought up in a community where those beliefs are strongly held, is limited. Her agency is very limited, and trying to make sure she has rights and she knows what those rights are important parts of ending the scourge of child marriage.
Do you find that this is more in rural areas than in the inner city?
No, because it depends on the population. So it's in rural areas among the Caucasian or white communities generally, but we see it among immigrant communities very strongly in urban areas. And so depending on the ethnicity and the type of group, and I don't want to name groups or names because it's not in any specific one, but you think about the range of immigrant populations in the United States, we see higher incidences of child marriage among many of the immigrant populations where we have subcultures and communities. And those are some of the American girls. They are American that we need to protect.
So if I would think that if you're in the city, you're more likely to be able to find help than you are out in a rural area. So how do you get this information to these young girls? Is the school mandated to report it if they see, because they're mandated to report abuse? Does it make a difference if they're married and they're being abused versus their family? How do they work to get out?
This is part of the trap. And several of the survivors that I've spoken to said that when they discussed their marriage, they discussed any abuse that they were surviving with anyone outside their close-knit community that approved of the marriage, there would be conversations, but because they're a child, their partner, their spouse becomes their guardian. And so the role of the justice system in the United States is to return children to their legal guardians as quickly as possible. And so often they would get steps to get out, and then the courts or the system would return them back to their spouse because that spouse is their legal guardian. There were girls who needed their spouse to sign off on their school report cards. In those communities where parents normally would sign your report cards to keep you in school, they would have to have their abusive spouse or sign off on things like report cards to allow them to continue in school and be completely dependent upon them for all of the activities of daily living that you would normally expect a parent or guardian to do, because once they're married, their spouse becomes that in most states.
Well, and that used to be the case. You couldn't open a bank account. A woman couldn't own a bank account.
Yeah, till 1972. Exactly.
Yeah, or her husband had to sign for it, right?
Exactly. We'll take a 17-year-old girl. She can't open a bank account. She can't enter into a legal contract. She can't sign a lease. And in most states, the assumption is if you're 16 or 17 and you get married, you become emancipated. And that's actually not true. In very few states do you immediately become emancipated and have the rights of an adult within limited bounds as a minor. In most states, you would also have to apply to the court to become emancipated to have any of those rights. And so you become much more at the mercy of a spouse, which allows for all of this financial control, financial abuse, emotional control, and emotional abuse, and in the terrible cases, domestic violence and physical abuse.
So if a minor marries a minor, though, let's say they married off their daughter to somebody who's also a minor, who's in control then? Are they emancipated, or is it their families that are still in control?
I don't know. That would have to be, each state would have a different law as to how that would work. And so I actually don't know. But what we found in the research that Unchained at Last did is minors marrying minors were very rare exception. They were not the majority. Romeo and Juliet is what we think of. Our grandparents getting married, at 17 and 18 are the fairy tales that we tell ourselves.
Right.
When we talk about child marriage, but it's not the reality for the vast majority of these young girls.
My grandmother was 15. My grandfather was 18.
Yep.
On my dad's side, very young. And you could tell that affected her the rest of her life, how she handled things. She was a child, and then she had a child.
Mm-hmm.
So she didn't handle life well. The other thought I had is when you go to the doctors, at least in Ohio, they ask, do you feel safe at home? They're looking for abusive situations and situations that are bad for the individual. What happens in that instance? Because they're going to ask. They asked my child even at pediatrician's office.
Yep. So talking to the two survivors that I know best. One is named Genevieve. The other is named Sarah. They say that when they would have been asked that question, there would have been the threat at home that if they said anything, the abuse would be worse, or it would be taken out upon them, or they would be removed from school, or something else would happen. And so that they would be coerced into silence in those moments. And the courage that it would take to talk to somebody and ask for help was more than they could muster in that situation as a 16 or 17-year-old. In a relationship that was controlled by a partner.
Well, I'm sure they also have a threat if they have a child of taking the child away.
Yes, that's also a huge concern.
You know, it's interesting that this isn't a crime, but yet in Cleveland, we had a gentleman who abducted 3 women, kept them in the house, all teenagers, had children with one of them. That is something he went to prison for, and actually he killed himself, I believe, in prison, but that's a crime. This is not.
Right. That was a forced kidnapping as opposed to a coerced marriage. But when many, I want to say most, and I will say most child marriages are coerced. They are often forced by the family upon the girl, given whatever circumstances drive them to it, whether it's a pregnancy, whether it's sexual activity, or whether it's, cultural practices or financial need. But a forced marriage is a marriage where there is lack of agency. And that's what we need to protect girls from is underage marriage and forced marriage. And so that's why we focus so heavily on the ending child marriage with no exceptions, age 18, no exceptions. If people want to get married, they can wait another 6 months till they're 18. There's not a belief that there needs to be any exceptions to that. And 10 states have now agreed. And I can give you those.
Yeah, what are the 10 states, if you know them?
I am getting there. Okay, it started with Delaware and New Jersey, became the first 2 in 2018. Then we got the American Samoa and U.S. Virgin Islands were actually non-states, but protectorates of the United States that ended child marriage. Then we got Pennsylvania, Minnesota, Rhode Island, and New York. Massachusetts in 2022 went from age 17 to 18. We got Vermont, Connecticut, and Michigan in 2023.
So my state is not one of them. Ohio is not.
Ohio is not one. I'm in Washington State. We're not one. We're actually one of the states also that doesn't have a minimum age with judicial or parental approval, along with California. So the states that we're working on right now are Washington, California, Colorado, and Virginia. And so we're just going state by state with the coalition, the National Coalition to End Child Marriage, trying to focus on state legislatures where there's a bill sponsor, where we actually have found someone in the state legislature who's willing to sponsor a bill. And if they can find a partner in the other chamber, so in both the House and the Senate at the state level needs to be done. We need to have a groundswell of support from individuals in that state who are willing to talk to their state legislatures. And then we need to move the bill through the state process. And it's not a race, it's a marathon. It took 7 years in Michigan for them to finally pass the laws, because they had to amend 7 different statutes because of the way the laws are written in Michigan State. It's in Washington State, it's much simpler. We have a single statute we need to amend, but our senator had proposed it when he was a representative in the House as long as 8 years ago, and it never got traction. It was never perceived to be large enough of an issue because only 8,000 girls are married in Washington state over that 8-year period. So that's only 1,000 a year. So those 1,000 girls, let's not protect them. Well, let's get this on the agenda. Let's protect those girls and stop the human rights abuse in every state.
Well, Ohio is a large trafficking state as well because of our highway system.
If you go to Unchained at Last, I will open your statistics for Ohio. In Ohio, you had 4,995 children married between 2000 and 2018.
Wow.
So almost 5,000 children in Ohio State alone.
Wow. You would think that statistic would make somebody step up and start to make a change in Ohio.
Yep, exactly.
So you mentioned a couple things that, are going on in the different states. If somebody was in Ohio, what would be their first step to try to change this law?
The first step I would go to is you can take a quick action if you go to www.stopchildmarriages.org. That's www.stopchildmarriages.org is a website that Zonta USA and UNICEF USA have put together that has the basic facts about child marriage, but it also has a UNICEF USA driven fast action where you can message your state representative and tell them to end child marriage in your state. That's a great place to start. Then I would go to Unchained at Last has a take action, join your state coalition. And they are taking names of both organizations and individuals who want to become active to end child marriage in their state. And when they see a critical mass, they create that coalition. And so basically you can get on the list with Unchained at Last, who convenes these state coalitions, so that when they're ready to activate in your state, you'll be notified, you'll get involved. Or if you actually can get your state representative to be a sponsor of the bill, send an email to hello@zontausa.org or to Unchained at Last and let them know you have a bill sponsor in your state, and we'll activate immediately.
That's great. Are there groups that need financial support? So let's say somebody said, I'm not going to get involved in that way, but they want to use another option.
Financial support to Unchained at Last is absolutely invaluable. So I strongly recommend supporting Unchained at Last. That's at the US level. That's where most of the funding is going to do both survivor support as well as advocacy action. And you can designate there which way you want to do it. You can also support your local Zonta club and ask them to put those funds towards a end child marriage advocacy action. At the international level, UNICEF does the best work internationally on ending child marriage, as well as Girls Not Brides. Or you can donate directly to the Zonta Foundation for Women and designate service projects internationally to end child marriage. So there are lots of different ways to do it, but looking at the core players in the coalitions to end child marriage internationally, it's Zonta International with our Zonta Foundation for Women, UNICEF worldwide, Girls Not Brides, and then in the US, it's Zonta USA, UNICEF USA, and Unchained at Last.
So that's on a large scale. Is there anything small, local, that an individual can do if they see somebody in that situation? Is there anything they can do? Report it somewhere? Is there something that if you see a young girl who needs help, she's being abused, she's married, is there,
if it's an abuse situation, what you should do is do what you would do in any situation of domestic violence and domestic abuse. And that is encourage the individual to contact the National Domestic Violence Hotline, which is available on the Zonta USA website, but it's also, let me get that. It's 800-799-7233 is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, 800-799-7233. That will get the individual connected with their local resources. So this is a national network that connects with local domestic violence shelters and support systems, depending on what the individual needs. They may end up in this situation where there is no shelter that can take them, but there are people who will help them work through that complexity to make sure that they are safe or get the resources they need. What the DV hotlines find is that it often takes 4 or more connections with an individual before they're ready to take action. So the most important thing is to encourage that individual to reach out for the help that they need and give them the resources and keep on asking them to do it. Don't expect it to be one and done. Don't expect someone who's suffering from any kind of, especially emotional or financial control and abuse, to be able to extricate themselves from that situation very rapidly. You have to be there consistently and encourage them that you're going to stay there to support them and get them connected to the support services they need. And don't abandon them if they go back to the abuser. It is clearly what's needed to help girls get strong enough to be able to leave or change these situations is multiple points of contact.
So these organizations, there's trauma, right, related to this with everything that they go through. They provide some sort of psychological support in moving forward as well as financial to get them settled, correct?
Yes, Unchained at Last does that very, very challenging work. And they actually have support groups for survivors of child marriage because they find that the girls have had unique experiences, and being able to talk to peers who have been through similar circumstances is much more helpful than being in a general group that may not understand the particular nuances and issues of being a child survivor. But it definitely needs both the financial and the mental health support as someone leaves any kind of abusive relationship, but in particular a child trying to leave an abusive relationship. The women that we work with who are survivors, some are as old as 50 or 60 and were child brides, and they're still living and working through that trauma that they had as a 15, 16, or 17-year-old girl. You can imagine how impressionable you are at that age. Right. And how not having control or agency and feeling you have to live through this, and it's what it's expected of you by your community, your society, your family, or that you've been pushed into this by your family, is a particular pain that is felt very, very deeply.
Do their children have the effects of that as well? Have there been studies with that?
I don't know of any studies on that, but again, anecdotally with the survivors I've spoken to, that they've worked very hard to try and help their children emerge strongly from the difficult situations. But it also takes support for those kids.
Yeah, I could see them perpetuating that forward, right? They've been in an abusive situation. This is what they've seen. Abusers tend to breed abusers. So, if you have a son that saw that, you might end up being somebody who marries a young bride as well, because that's what he knew, right?
There is a cycle of violence, and there is also a presumption in some communities that this is the man's right. There are societies where it is the patriarchal assumption that this is how things should go, and this is the control that a man should have over women in his life. And one of the ways to do that is to actually marry young, so that you can establish that early on and maintain that. And that is not a cycle you want perpetrated.
Right. You know, it's funny, in my head went that phrase, "You've come a long way, baby." Do you remember that?
Yes.
It is a commercial, I think. And really not so much. You know, when you look at our life today, it's 2023. We should not be having this conversation.
We shouldn't. We shouldn't be having this conversation. We're also having this conversation, and I'm going to point out the complexity right now with immigration law. One of the things that we're also seeing, in addition to the state laws, is that there are tremendous value to access to a spousal visa in the United States. And there is a strong interest for families to marry their daughters to foreign men so those men can then immigrate to the United States. And so one of the things we're also looking at with Unchained at Last and the AHA Foundation is how to create new laws at the federal level that create some controls on spousal age, especially underage girls being married to men more than 4 years their senior for the purposes of visa access.
So the families are getting paid, probably.
Yes, or other kinds of support, remuneration, status, whatever it might be. There's many different value systems and belief systems that come into play, but it's, again, abusive and not in the best interests of the child. And that's what we have to focus on, is what is in the best interest of the child and how to help these young girls live and thrive and not be settled into awful situations.
So I'm going to bring this up, even though I know it's a touchy subject, but it seems to me that if we ban abortion across the country, that there would be an uptick in child marriage. If part of the reason why these young ladies can get married off is because they happen to get pregnant, wouldn't that be an issue that we would be facing with that?
I would think that it would, again, limit the agency and the options of the girl, which would lead to further entrapment as one of the likely consequences. And I believe in some states that they're already seeing certainly an uptick in unwed mothers, and also then in forced or arranged or child marriages for those unwed mothers. It's a natural progression. You can see that it would happen.
That's the scary part. The whole thing is scary, but that just adds one more layer of a battle that we would have to fight as women to protect our rights and our children's rights. So, well, this has been a very sobering podcast today, knowing what the statistics are, but there are things that we're doing to make a change.
Yes, and any individual can help make that change by contacting their state representative. What's awesome about our state representatives is, rather than the federal representatives who have hundreds of thousands of constituents, usually your state representative represents a part of your city or your county. They'll often only have 10,000 people in their district. And so they listen to every member of their district who contacts them about an issue. So there's a real listening and an opportunity for every individual to contact their state representative or their state senator and say that this is important to them to end child marriage. And could they become a sponsor of a bill at the state level? Use the information at www.stopchildmarriages.org. For information, statistics, if you want to have those in your hand before you talk to a representative. The letter that UNICEF USA writes with you when you take action at that stopchildmarriages.org website has the statistics for the states, so that that information gets to the representatives or the state senators. And then Zonta has a whole set of toolkits on our Zonta USA website. If you go to zontausa.org/stopchildmarriages, you will see a huge set of social media, pre-written letters, all kinds of actions that both individuals and clubs can take to help build a coalition in their state to end child marriage.
Oh, you don't have to be part of Zonta. You don't have to be a Zonta in order to access that.
Right. StopChildMarriages.org is for any member of society. That's why UNICEF USA and Zonta USA built it as a separate and public website, is that it is a resource that is available and we are trying to make very visible via social media, Instagram, Facebook. Please share that website and ask your friends to go to that site. And it's got a little red button that says Act Now. It takes you to a form that UNICEF USA has created that will message your representative. So you have to put in your address because they have to be able to match you to your representative, but you're not put on any mailing lists. UNICEF USA will not mail you any junk mail. Zonta USA will not mail you any junk mail. It is specifically for the purposes of contacting your representative, so that you can advocate for ending child marriage.
Well, thank you so very much for being on. Our time's up. I can't believe how fast it went. But if you're watching this podcast today and you know someone that's in that situation, please take action. Please help that individual. I think that this was an important topic to get through this challenge of early marriage. And thank you so much for being on. You were a wealth of information. I learned a whole lot today.
Great. Well, thank you for having me, and it's lovely meeting you.
Karen, any other questions?
Just want our listeners to know that all this information will be in the show notes. So what you didn't capture, we will have all the links there, and please take action. We all need to take action.
We do. Thank you so much.
Great.
Have
Thank
a great
you.
day.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.